Long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series and beyond. I am your host, Constant Reader Scott Daly, and I'm joined, as always, by the recently squatted Matt Freeman. How's it going, Matt?
Okay, I'm good.
This introduction brought to you by the fact that Matt doesn't know what squatting means.
Well, so I was assuming that I was either in a suitcase or perhaps in a shroud or like having a ski mask pulled over my head with the mouth sewn shut, a la Mission Impossible. But you know, I have no idea what squatting.
I mean, one interpretation of that noise you just made was that squatting is getting your tongue cut out. So
that's possible.
This week on the show, there's more walking, Matt, as we continue with chapters 7 through 9 of Stephen King's Richard Bachman's The Long Walk. I don't know how to do these summaries at the very beginning of the episode anymore, because it's like, well, they walk a lot.
Yeah.
And also some of them die.
Yeah, more of them die. I mean, that is, we talked about this last time, and that's why the discussion question was what it was, is that this book, I mean, it's not that it doesn't have a plot, but it really is more about this organic unfolding of events, and you know, one damn thing after another. And yeah, they just keep walking. I mean, I guess the thing that jumps out to me about this week's reading is that we got McVrees's backstory. That seemed significant.
And a fascinating backstory it is, Matt. I want to spend so much time really diving into the between the lines of that story he tells and what it says about him.
For sure.
Yeah, I am just overall, like, I loved this book the first time I read it. I continue to love this book. This reread is going really, really great for me. I'm just absolutely devouring these pages we have to read each week. Man, what a novel. What, seriously, like, I guess here's something I want to ask you. And I thought about this. I didn't put this in the script because I thought about it, only about an hour ago as I was mentally preparing for the show. We talk a lot about the world building in this book, or the lack thereof. And I'm wondering if you like, I think our general tactic on this is, our whole principles of charity and reading thing, assume the author is a genius and everything's intentional. And we say, oh, he's hiding the world building from us intentionally to create this air of mystery where we don't really understand the full scope of this world and what's going on in it. And I certainly think that's a fair read, and I think it's the more fun read. But I'm curious if you think at all that there is a possibility here that the lack of, real concrete understanding of the world that surrounds the Long Walk is a flaw created by an inexperienced writer.
So I don't think I'll be able to fully answer until we finished.
Sure.
Because I don't know what other information is revealed, obviously. But I think, the only way in which I could see it as a flaw would be if there are ways, there are things that could have been made more clear about what King is trying to say if we understood the way the world was a little bit better. Because as it is, I'm just kind of assuming that this is like Americana, except a few meaningless things are kind of different. And also there's the Long Walk.
Yeah.
And it's like, if that's what King wanted me to think, perfect. He did a perfect job. It's not a flaw at all. If he wanted me to get the impression that there was some specific, nefarious element of our country that had come to the fore and taken over or something like that, then that didn't come across. The thing is, I think the former is the case. I think that King is much like Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, which we continue to have, to reference with reason. The idea is that, like, hey, it's basically like our society. Maybe a couple things are different, but basically these people are just like us. These people are no different from you and me.
Yeah.
And yet this atrocity exists in their midst. And I think the idea, or one of the ideas of that story specifically, was like, well, look at yourselves and ask yourself, like, hey, do we have a long walk? Do we have a thing that's horrible that we all do and we all just kind of either ignore or actually enjoy and cheer for? that is actually horrible. And we probably do. I mean, I think we have some of those things in the real world. So I think that's the idea here.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think this is a good thing for us to revisit in our overview episode once we're finished with the book. But I do like what you said about how this very much seems to just be our world, except because I mean, like, we still have pop culture references, right? King can't help it. Like, there's a Happy Days reference in this week's reading, and so it seems like we are at least running very, very closely parallel to the world that you and I live in this thing. So perhaps that is part of the world building, is like, we're not going to say anything about the world outside of the walk, except for the fact that this thing exists causes you to question what type of world it might be, which, just as you said, causes you to question, do we have an analog for this in our world?
Yeah. I mean, it's, one thing it causes us to do is to pay attention to any slight mention of deviations from the way our world is.
Yeah.
And it's like, we're hungry for like the explanation. The scene at the end where it's like, the president of the American Confederacy comes forward and shakes the winner's hand or whatever, and you're like, oh, I get it, but like, that's sure. I don't think that's going to happen, actually. Like, I think I don't think that's what we're doing with this story.
Yeah, I think this is a great way of kind of starting off, because this is a after I just said, is this a weakness of the book, I'm going to actually, here at the beginning of chapter 7, point out a place in which I think King's lack of world building becomes one of its strengths. So jumping off here with chapter 7, this chapter begins with us introduced to a walker we haven't really interacted with before. This is a character named Scram. Scram is notable for a few reasons, but the first is that he's 16, already married with a kid on his way. Garrity learns this information, is like flabbergasted, which I think is our reaction too, right? Because the question immediately becomes, what the fuck are you doing here? You have a wife and a kid? What are you doing here?
Yeah, absolutely. It's go ahead.
No, I just think this is what I mean about the lack of world building, right? Because, as you said, it makes you immediately question, what is this world like? What is this place like that a 16-year-old who is married, who has dropped out of school, is married and has a kid on the way, decides to do what is essentially murder, right? Decides to like just sign up to do this. Like and what is a world like in which this guy thought that this risk was worth it?
Yeah, I think it all goes back to what Garrity said at the very beginning, where he said this is for the best one way or the other.
Yeah.
Which once again means it'll be better for me to be dead than to live whatever life was ahead of me. It's and that is interesting, because it's like, as they're walking through the countryside, you don't see devastating deprivation, right? This is not a Dust Bowl. This is not a sci-fi dystopia. Like, it's a dystopia in the sense of this is the government and society, but actually everybody seems to have relatively sufficient material goods. So that makes it interesting, right? Because King didn't have to do that, right? King could have made it more obvious. Like, he could have had all the people showing up at the roadside be like emaciated or something like that.
And I think it also goes into your whole military reference here as well, right? Because how many young 18-year-old men in the military sign up despite having a wife and a kid or a kid on the way back at home,
Yeah, well, that's a good point. I mean, just in general, it's a sort of fact of the world that men often do sign up to do incredibly dangerous jobs of various kinds, not just military. And it's that's the way the world works. Somebody's got to do those jobs. They usually pay pretty well. Not always.
Yeah, and I mean, it is true that one of the biggest recruitment tools of the military in the post-draft era has been a path of advancement forward in your career, right? Like, be it just paying for college. I mean, my father was in the Air Force, and that's how he got his college paid for, is he signed up for the Air Force and they paid his school, and then he was in the Air Force for 5 years. Like that is certainly a path for a lot of people. And so this is, I think, aligns up with that again. It's like, this is your path to something. Like you have no prospects really. You know, we learned this kid, he's dropped out of school. He's doing okay, I guess, but this is a path, certainly.
I like that. Yeah, that's a good connection. The other thing about Scram is like, hey, did you also know a kid like this when you were a kid, where like it was a kid your age, but they gave off a vibe of being like 42.
Yeah.
And like, and then it would happen even more in college when you're like 20 and you'd meet a classmate who was married and you'd be like, you can't do that.
Yeah.
What? We're just babies. We're just...
Yeah, no, definitely. I knew people like that for sure. And actually, my one of my wife's good friends got married at 20, maybe even 19. I don't know.
Okay.
Gosh, yeah. In school, they went to school together and were married.
Wow,
half of their schooling. It's wild.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Speaking of hints of world building, though, there's a lot to love in Scram's story. This is one thing that I really liked. He says here, I dropped out of school when I was 14. There was no point to it, not for me. I wasn't no troublemaker, just not able to make grades. And our history teacher read us an article about how schools are overpopulated. So I figured, why not let somebody who can learn sit in, and I'll get down to business. I love this because I love the framing of schools are overpopulated, right? Because that's such a fascinating way of framing an issue. And I think it, again, speaks subtly about the world these kids live in, because come on, right? Like, it's in the public school system, the problem is never that there's too many kids.
Right.
The problem is that there's not enough schools.
Yeah.
The problem is they don't have enough money. The problem is they don't have enough teachers. And that's like, I don't know how things are where you live, but in Texas, we are facing a massive teacher shortage right now. They cannot retain or hire enough teachers for all the children. And that's not an overpopulation issue. That's a funding issue. That's an administrative issue. And it's so interesting the way that it's framed here from the perspective of a teacher that's talking to them, that schools are overpopulated.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be a society that doesn't value education, and really, I mean, I think everything in the book does point to the idea that the populace are being made docile by all kinds of forces, but like everyone is just very passive. I still have this thesis that I think is still holds after this week, that like Garrity at this point in the story is sort of the perfect creation of this society. Where he's totally focused on survival. I was thinking about what we talked about last week and how each character kind of embodies a different strategy or a different approach toward life. Maybe we didn't actually say it in those words, but I'm saying it now. Each character sort of embodies a different attitude toward life. You know, you could go down the list and be more detailed about that. Maybe we'll have a chance to do that at some point today, but Garrity specifically, like, he's just putting one foot in front of the other. He doesn't know why he's here. He doesn't really know what he's doing. He's just going to get through the day. He gives these speeches about how money doesn't matter, and like the future isn't real, and these like weird ideas. And he's just, it seems to me like he's the perfect avatar of a society that's all built around just like, keep your head down.
Yeah. Mind
your own business, put one foot in front of the other. And like, that's why, I mean, maybe we can make a prediction at this point. Like, I kind of predict that Garrity is going to be the winner, partially because he's the protagonist and that would be the thing to do, I guess. But also because that would thematically line up with this idea that I just said, where it would make sense that the winner of the long walk would be the guy who was kind of built by the society to be a fit for this challenge. He's like and I don't know if I don't know what that's gonna look like exactly. Like, is he gonna have some catharsis before then, or is he just kind of, is this just a through and through tragedy where he, you know, he survives and it's like you kind of almost wish he didn't. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling there, but
no, it's fascinating. I love it.
Yeah. Anyway.
I like this a lot. I think the ending of the book will certainly reveal that general idea, but I really liked your your thesis about each of these boys is a different way of living life, because I think you can kind of construct the long walk as a metaphor for life itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, this idea of what is life but walking for a very long time down a road, and if you stop, you die, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so a construction of the walk as life in each of these kids and how they handle it as a different way of exploring how to handle life. And we have this guy Scram right here, who is this guy who, seems like he feels like he knows something that everyone else doesn't, right? Mm-hmm. That, like, one of the things he says about these kids is, you don't know why you're here. I know why I'm here. I know what's at stake. I understand this whole thing, and therefore that gives me strength that you don't have. It is something that he's absolutely convinced of, that he's going to win because he's the only one actually thinking about the prize. He's the only one actually thinking about what he could win here, because I think he says he wants his kid to go to college. His kid's going to be smart like his wife, and he wants his kid to go to college, and he's going to do what it takes to get there. And we see here, we don't know Scram's ultimate fate quite yet, but we do see over the course of these chapters that he has caught a cold that is steadily getting worse, which seems to indicate that he's in a lot of trouble. So it does reflect on this understanding that he thought he had not mattering in the long run, which is an interesting reflection on what King's trying to say here.
Yeah. I was thinking a lot about how the different characters kind of have their own way of mentally grappling with it. And the interesting thing about Garrity is he basically doesn't at all. He just, which is what makes him unique, actually. It's like his almost indifference to it is what makes him unique.
Yeah, and then the question becomes, if he is the winner at the end of the day, is King saying that outlook on life is a good one to have, or in this case, just the one that is successful in this world? Yeah, well, we'll have to see.
Yeah.
I also really liked this quote right here. It's Pearson kind of talking back to Scram about what the stakes of this whole thing are. He says, "I understand what it is to die, I think," Pearson said abruptly. "Now I do, anyway. Not death itself. I still can't comprehend that. But dying. If I stop walking, I'll come to an end." He swallowed, and there was a click in his throat, just like a record after the last groove. He looked at Scram earnestly. "Maybe it's like you say. Maybe it's not enough. But I don't want to die." Scram looked at him almost scornfully. "You think just knowing about death will keep you from dying?" I love that whole interaction so much.
Yeah, that bit really stuck with me afterward. I think one thing that I see woven throughout this story is the idea that human beings crave some kind of control over their world, but death is something that nobody can control, and so everybody's sort of forced to have their own understanding of death. That's all we can have. That's all we can settle for. Pretty much, I think everybody struggles with this, and everybody comes to some kind of, psychological detente with it. But it still isn't control, right? It's just a narrative about death that you find satisfactory, or at least satisfactory enough that you could sleep at night. And we're seeing, obviously some of these boys walked into this race not having really grappled with that at all, and now they're grappling with it here. But I love that. I agree. Like it's I think in this week in particular, it really jumped out to me how much this is not just about, a walk. This is about the way we approach life and death individually.
Yeah. Yeah, because that sentiment right there, like you think just knowing about death will keep you from dying? No, of course not. But that is something that young person, like I don't know anything about death itself. I can't comprehend death, but the act of dying, I am face to face with it now. It is right in front of me, and I understand it now, and I fear it. And the simple idea that in and of itself is enough to motivate you to avoid it is not enough. At least that's what Scram's saying.
Right, because you can't actually control it. And I mean, Scram, of course, I guess it's ironic that Scram is saying that, because in this moment he's acting as though like, yeah, but my attitude though, like the source of my reasons, that's a good source, I'm going to make it. And then it's like, well, no, you can't control it either. Your mental psychological understanding or beliefs or whatever you think it is that you have, it's nothing. It's
Yeah.
the Kyle like a wind is going to come rip through whatever story you had told yourself.
Yeah. You're absolutely right that Scram feels that the thing he has up on all these other boys is he has the proper motivation, and what he has failed to realize that sometimes your motivation doesn't matter. Sometimes you just get a cold, and what are you going to do now?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, it's like is the Olympic silver medalist like, I guess you just weren't motivated enough. It's like no, everybody was trying as hard as they could.
I do think that does speak to something that we really want to believe in, right? Like that is why these boys signed up. That is, I think, basically the someone has to win, don't they? Mentality, right? Like that you look at this thing and you believe you can have control over it. You believe you can summon enough motivation to overcome this thing, that it's just a matter of mind over matter. And it is, of course, that in some ways, but it's so much more than that too. Sometimes you get a cramp. You're like, can you mind over matter if your leg stops working?
Right. I just thought about this being all the other walkers are they're all writers, and they're all writing, and they all have a story about how they're going to be the best. They're going to be the most successful writers. And Stephen King is going. He's not thinking about that. He's just putting one book down after another, one book down after another. Not looking left or right. Just keeping his sandwich against his chest and cranking out novels. So one day he looks up and they're all dead.
We got to circle back around to this idea once we get to the end for sure, because I think it's really difficult to say what the book is ultimately saying until we know what's at the end of that walk. For sure.
That's true. Yeah.
All right. So the boys keep on walking, and they come across a couple of young girls in what is described as very tight clothing. And Matt, oh my gosh, we've got a lot to talk about here. So first, Garrity sees these women and gets very excited. The text says the faces of these girls were hot, flushed, and excited by something ancient, sinuous, and to Garrity, erotic almost to the point of insanity. He felt animal lust rising in him, an aggressive, alive thing that made his body shake with a pulsed fever all its own. Like, that's insane.
Uh-huh.
That's but
yeah.
and then I think importantly we see here that it's not just Garrity that feels this way, right? Because a different walker, Gribble, rushes over to these women and starts basically groping one of them.
Yeah.
The text is pretty clear, or at least from the perspective of our protagonist, that this woman is excited by the prospect and is kind of inviting it as well. And the result here is that Gribble gets a serious case of the blue balls, which ultimately gets him killed. Garrity himself is so excited by the memory of these women that he jizzes his pants. Matt, what the fuck are we doing here?
Well, first of all, and I'm sorry to say it, but the idea of a literally fatal case of blue balls is hilarious. And I thought that was great.
Yeah.
I mean, I said in the last episodes that I wasn't sure what we were doing with the recurring sexual themes, but all we can say, or, one thing we can say is that they sure are escalating in intensity. I mean, it went from one kind of, slightly risque interaction to literally ejaculating in his pants, because and like the idea of ancient sinuous erotic, like it's this, like it's almost like a human sacrifice thing. It's interesting because he doesn't really explicitly make the comparison, but the image that jumped to mind was basically just like human sacrifice rituals, where like these like ancient religions where there's always like sex and sacrifice bound up with each other. And it's, I don't know if that was just me kind of pattern matching or if that's in there,
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it, but I mean, now that you say it, I kind of like it. This idea of these are the warrior men of this society, going out there and doing these things, and these women are kind of placed alongside the road to be an offering to them in some ways. That they're offering themselves up to the warrior men. I like that. I mean, I think there is something very intensely you know, traditionally masculine in everything we're doing here, right? I mean, we already talked about it was a choice to make them all boys. Of course it was. We're exploring masculinity here in a lot of very interesting ways, and one of them is this like kind of base, or as you would call it, pink animalistic lust that is overcoming these boys. Like this kid dies. He dies because of it.
Yeah.
And Garrity like is almost consumed with it himself. And I think, you can do the thing where, because the character whose head we're in experiences this, and we see another character act on that feeling, you can kind of assume that this is a thing that's happening to all or most of the boys as well, that this is a shared experience that they're all going through. And certainly really fascinating how it is. I think you're absolutely right. Increasing in intensity, increasing in as they're kind of in some ways devolving as the walk goes on. They're becoming less human and more animalistic.
Yeah, and at this point, it's actually a little makes me a little anxious knowing how much of the book we have left, because it's like, well, okay, how much runway do we have left here in terms of like what other sorts of, like, what happens the next time there's the posse of sexy girls by the side of the road? Like,
yeah,
does Garrity, is he unable to control himself, or some of the, I mean, we already had one kid die from it. So like, what's left, right?
Sure.
Like what levels of development of this theme do we have left? I don't know.
And another kind of wrinkle in this whole thing is that not long after this event, Garrity observed Stebbins back at the pack. He's basically where he's been the entire time, just chilling at the back. And he feels this intense wave of rage towards him for basically no reason at all. And I think this is part and parcel of the same thing, right? I think these are tying together in a way.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't really know exactly what to make of it. I mean, it's like, okay, you've got sexuality, you've got maybe, competition and these sort of classically male emotions like competitiveness. And somehow he's chosen Stebbins as like the guy who he is competing with. Interestingly, doesn't feel like he's competing with, for example, McVrees. It's like McVrees and him are like blood brothers, whereas Stebbins is something more like a competitor that he is desperate to beat, which is itself fascinating because he has to beat both of them actually. I think part of the context of the moment in my mind was regarding the rage, was that part of the rage was due to the fact that Stebbins wasn't really reacting to what was happening, like as if Stebbins, he's free and above such human shackles as Garrity is subject to, like sexuality. And that makes him even more angry.
And we'll see the same thing with the watermelon at the end of this week's reading, right? That he's the only one of the boys that doesn't even really try for any of that watermelon.
Yeah.
So yeah, everything human about these kids, whether it be the baser human instinct or what, is seemingly just so far removed from Stebbins, and Garrity sees that and it enrages him.
Yeah, it's interesting. The rage is an interesting response to that, I guess. I'm not sure if I fully understand what we're doing with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, and I honestly think this is part of the design of the walk, is that like the state's ability to turn these kids on each other, right? Like you talked last week about how optimistic you saw this story so far, and I agreed with you that like despite all this, the kids were still banding together, they were working together, they were helping each other, and that continues into this week's reading as well. And yet we have this one guy who doesn't want to participate in any of that.
But I think it's still interesting along the lines that it's Stebbins' philosophy, you could say, his approach to life is like, I'm not going to let anything touch me. I'm going to be monk-like. I'm not going to. Let's pretend Stebbins is living his normal life as a man in the world, and it's like, I'm the way I'm going to get through this is I'm not going to have a wife. I'm not going to have friends. I'm not going to indulge myself in pleasures of the flesh. I'm going to be abstemious and save my money and and what? Like,
Yeah.
and what? You're still going to die.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
what are you saving it for? And so
Mhm.
like, it's not like it wins you anything. I think I honestly predict that Stebbins is going to die, just like 99 of these other boys. And this story he's told himself about, self-denial or whatever, it's like, yeah, it doesn't matter. The universe doesn't care. This is just a cope, just like everyone else. Everyone else has their copes.
Mhm.
And this is just yours.
Yeah, no, I like that. I mean, also his place in the structure of the walk itself really lends to this as well. I think he's always at the back, right? He's
Mm-hmm.
from the very beginning he was at the back, which in the context of the walk makes a lot of sense to be at the very back of the line, because you can basically guarantee that you're never walking too fast, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you're the closest way of measuring your relative speed is, well, if I slow down below 4 miles an hour, I'll get a warning eventually. And if I never pass any of these other kids, I will never be going too fast either. And
Mm-hmm.
so he's allowed himself this perfect spot where he's only always walking as fast as he needs to. And but that metaphor for life is like he's letting everyone else go in front of him, right? And he's drafting on them his entire life. He's allowing them to experience these things. He's allowing them to go through these trials and tribulations, and he's just quietly at the back observing and drafting on all those things. And yeah, that is that the way to live life? Is that the way to win at life? Well, we'll see.
Yeah, exactly.
So Baker starts talking about his uncle, who we learn was an undertaker, and the kids all echo the who watches the watchman mentality by asking who buries an undertaker. And I don't have a lot to say about this. I absolutely adored that conversation. I adored like McVree's like getting increasingly mad that he won't answer the question, like, but no, who buried him? Your uncle who buried him? And then the answer ends up being nobody. He was cremated.
which is hilarious. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
I love that so much. It's
Yeah.
brilliant. And yeah, this once again, like, very realistic conversation, but it as this goes on, the conversations start to be more about death. They start to revolve around death in some way.
Yeah. I also like the idea of like, if we take the who buries the undertaker and connect that to our who watches the watchman metaphor, the answer is nobody, because the undertaker is so aware of the system that he decides he doesn't want to be any part of it. So when he dies, he removes himself from the equation, and nobody's watching the watchers.
Oh, I love that. No, I didn't think of that at all. That's amazing. That's perfect. Yeah.
I really liked this quote as well. The mystery that is Raymond Garrity continues. So they're talking here, and he says, "Who buried him? Tell us so we can discuss world problems or baseball or birth control or something." "I think birth control is a world problem," Garrity said seriously. "My girlfriend is a Catholic," and then he gets cut off. And that's like, holy shit, man. Who are you? Like, who is this kid?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's very funny because he's done this thing a few times where he kind of has like a hobby horse, and he's just like gotta tell everybody about it. Yeah, he's very unique. He's interesting,
and he has said multiple times that he's not that religious, right? So maybe he's just adopting this Catholic stance on birth control because of his girlfriend. I don't know. Maybe he doesn't even believe it at all, but she does, and he's decided to make her this totemic figure in his life. So now he's just going to make sure that everyone knows that he's on her side with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe that's interesting. The idea of birth control being, he says birth control is a world problem, and yet we just had this beat earlier in the chapter about schools being overpopulated. It's just, I guess I don't know what to do with that exactly, other than that we have two relatively close together mentions of the idea of like population control.
Sure.
In a pretty short frame of time.
Yeah, and I wonder if I'm trying to think of a way to tie this into your central idea of Garrity as being representative of like a perfect product of the state, in that he looks around at everything going on. He looks around at overpopulation at schools, as we'll call it. He looks around at the fact that the long walk exists and 100 kids are murdered every year. and he says one of the biggest world problems we have right now is birth control, which seems to be like the perfect classically conservative agent of the state argument, right?
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I was also thinking like really, like you live in this world and you're gonna choose that to be a thing and it's like he's just kind of swallowing a line he's been given about like these are the things that are very important and we should worry about. Yep. While in the meantime the society is shooting kids in the head.
And I really do feel that Garrity's continued inability to come up with an adequate reason for why he's here almost does speak to a kind of representation of he's someone that actually believes in nothing, really.
Yeah, right.
Or at least not consciously believes in anything.
Yeah, it's interesting because like he doesn't see, it's not like he's emo. He just he just, that part of him is just kind of dead. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk this week a little bit about his dad, and I think that's the explanation, is like whatever part of him would be responsible for sort of thinking about that, I think is just numbed by that.
We're about to get into that, so let's just let's just go through this really quick. The only thing I wanted to talk about is we see Olsen here, who at this point in the book like basically starts just constantly whining to the guards to help him, to let him rest, but he's still walking. And that's one of the things throughout these 3 chapters. Like every time someone gets shot, Garrity like has this moment in the text where we say, was it Olsen? And no, it wasn't. Olsen is still going, somehow still going inexplicably. So let's talk about him for a bit, Matt. What do you think? What do you think about Olsen?
I think if Garrity doesn't win, then it's going to be Olsen. And I mean, Olsen is interesting because it's like it's sort of another note to this idea of like life and death are not rational. Like, oh yeah, Olsen, he's going to be the next to die, and then he just keeps walking, keeps putting one in front of the other. Like it doesn't matter what you think should happen.
Yeah,
the world doesn't have to work that way at all. But I think Olsen is I think Olsen's going to last a long time.
I do agree with you. This is kind of just one of the most cruelly random things that life does to you, right? Where you can have a person that runs every day, has never smoked a cigarette in their life and gets lung cancer. Yeah. And then you have a person that smokes a pack a day and lives until their 80s and never gets cancer at all. Like why? Why does that happen? Exactly. I don't know. Exactly. Sometimes it just does.
Yeah. I mean, I was basically thinking a similar metaphor, just like the person who always seems unhealthy, and yet they outlive all of their friends who were athletic, It's totally a thing that's allowed to happen.
Yep. It's the freaking walk, man. The walk of life.
Yep.
We also see that Percy, the son of we've seen this mother kind of go up to the walkers multiple times and scream out for her son at every town. Well, Percy makes a break for it. I actually love the buildup of this, Matt, because like they catch him like planning this 20 minutes before he makes his move, and they're trying really hard to like check him out and look at it without alerting anyone. And there's this real feeling that maybe he's got the guards fooled and he's gonna actually succeed in making a break for it. Mm-hmm. But of course, immediately gets his ticket. The guards, along with the rest of the kids, clocked this probably the first time he started doing it and knew it exactly.
Yeah, it's a really intense scene because you almost think that he might make it the way the scene is structured. Mm-hmm. But no, of course he doesn't. I mean, I think that cements this feeling, this certainty that this is just not that kind of story.
Yeah, totally. So then the boys pass a long-haul truck driver who flicks the kids off for wasting his time and delaying his shipment across the country. And this kind of prompts a conversation where we finally get a little bit more information on Garrity's father, like you were talking about earlier. We learn here that he was a truck driver and he got squatted, which seems to be a formal term in this world. But I think importantly, we learn here, Matt, that squatted isn't getting killed. Like perhaps we assumed or thought it was before. It's something else, but we see that Pearson says getting squatted beats getting dead. And so we have to say, okay, well then it's not getting dead. But we still don't really know what it is. And perhaps perhaps the reason we still don't know was because none of the kids actually know what squatted means.
Yeah, possibly. I guess, it's like it can't just be like, oh, they re-educate you, because it's like, well, then his dad would have been sent back at some point, but his dad never came back. And so my other guess is just like it's some kind of work camp, like a Siberian concentration camp or whatever, where you just live out your life doing menial labor, and which actually does seem that is what these sort of fascistic countries actually do. With a lot of their undesirables. So.
I think perhaps part of our confusion and why we assumed dead was Garrity does talk about him in past tense, right? Whenever he talks about his dad, it's like, even here, this paragraph I'm about to read, my father had been a sandy-haired giant, past tense. He's not dead, but he's not here anymore either. So he's in the past.
One thing about his dad that's really interesting is I sort of previously thought that he was going to come off as like heroic, maybe some kind of not necessarily freedom fighter, but like a rebel in some regard. And really, it doesn't sound like that was true. It sounds like he just couldn't, like in all the ways that Garrity is a good subject of the state, his father just wasn't. He complained. It says he blustered. He would say things he shouldn't say. And when people would warn him, like, hey, man, like, you're going to get in trouble talking like that, he would just keep doing it. And then one day the squads got him. And
yeah, no, you're right. I think there is a version of yourself that you could you could understand as this the secret freedom fighter. But yeah, no, he's I mean, truck driver is a pretty successful job. I think it says here, like, it says specifically, it would have been a good living if Jim Garrity could have kept his politics to himself. But he was a guy that we learned, could never keep money together, just wasn't able to do that, was never able to keep money around, and couldn't keep his mouth shut. And that is, in this world, the type of person that ends up getting squatted. So yeah, I mean, to go back to what you were talking about here, I think there's a lot of between the lines stuff about his father that Raymond is we kind of still processing and trying to understand, and not doing it consciously. I think importantly, this is stuff that we all have to kind of read into, because I think the idea of what we've been talking about is this person that is being the perfect little tool of the state, and also perhaps a person who doesn't believe in anything specifically himself, is a survival mechanism. He saw this happen to his father. He saw the type of person his father was, and he saw the consequences of that, and he made himself be the opposite of that.
Right. And importantly, it hasn't embittered him against the state. It has just shaped him in exactly the way that, that the state intended it to, which is you toe the line, you'll be fine. Okay. Yes, sir. I want to live.
And then perhaps the motivation here of joining the long walk is simply proving to himself and to the state that he is a good little citizen.
Yeah, that's possible. Yeah. I mean, I think the interesting thing about this flashback or paragraph of recollection, it's not really a flashback, it's just a paragraph, is that, like, I don't think Garrity's aware of how much this affected him. We're talking about this as having been a kind of core trauma for him that has really governed the way that he sees the world and the way he makes choices. But he hasn't really processed it. He doesn't realize that's the case. It really reminds me of how, you'll be reading Roland's point of view for hundreds of pages, and then he'll just throw in like, yes, and this, I guess that, that's back when I became a matricide. And then we're just like, what? What was that? What happened? Oh, we're not going to find out about that for another 3 books. And it's like, it's a similar writing technique where the most important thing about the character is so painful to the character, or just like operating at such a low level of like subconscious activity that it only like flashes through every once in a while. And you're like, what was that? And eventually you realize how important it actually is. But it takes time.
Yeah. No, I like that. I like that a lot. That's not a comparison I thought we'd make to this book, but no, that's great.
Well, he is a man who, walks. I was thinking about this. Like, it's not altogether silly. He's a man who chases a guy who is literally called the Walking Dude, and he himself is known for having walked, on foot. I mean, he had mounts at various times, obviously, but mostly he was walking. When we meet him at the beginning of The Gunslinger, he's walking. It's a long walk, right? He's chasing a guy, So I don't think it's kind of silly, but also, like, I do wonder how much of the writing of this book kind of shaped that as an idea in King's head.
No, I like that. I like that a whole bunch. All right, Matt. So our chapter ends with Garrity seeing a picnicking family by the side of the road, watching the walkers go by. Garrity might not believe in much, but he believes that these people are animals. They're monsters. And your boy, Pete McVrees, has some words for him. He says, the point is, they're the smart ones. They're not getting thrown to the lions. They're not staggering along and hoping they won't have to take a shit with 2 warnings against them. You're dumb, Garrity. You and me and Pearson and Barkovich and Stebbins, we're all dumb. Scram's dumb because he thinks he understands, and he doesn't. Olson's dumb because he understood too much too late. They're animals, all right, but what makes you so goddamn sure that makes us human beings? Love that, and I think that slots nicely into the conversation we've been having about how they're becoming kind of more animalistic as the walk goes on.
Mm-hmm. That's also one of our common human coping mechanisms, is to look around at people around us and be like, well, at least I'm not as bad off as they are. And once again, it's like, but you're still going to die. You're not going to get out of it. There's no winning. It's a very common a very common way of behaving. So
this feeling that I'm the enlightened one and these people are all the idiots who don't understand.
Exactly.
When you're just you're still one of the idiots, buddy.
Yeah, exactly.
I also think this is also very relatable to any kind of long distance race, because there is a point in that race where you look at the people sitting on the sidelines just relaxing and you just hate them all so much.
Yeah. I like that.
So the chapter ends with McVrees telling Garrity he's here for the same reason they all are. They want to die. Do you think this is true for everyone?
I mean, I don't think that is it Scrum?
Scram.
Scram. I don't think that Scram, like, if Scram wants to die, he doesn't know that. Like, maybe subconsciously, maybe he doesn't want to live the life that's been set out in front of him. So it's almost a more passive death by resignation, death by hopelessness, by just like, I guess this might as well happen either way, whatever. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to say McVrees is just talking about himself, even though McVrees clearly is talking about himself. I think the same probably does apply to many of the other boys. I don't know about all of them, though.
Sure. Yeah. And we'll see. But no, I think your point makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. Chapter 8. At 9:00 a.m., the walkers have been going for 24 hours now, and they're given another concentrate belt that has all their food for the day. All the walkers around Garrity kind of gorge themselves on food, but Ray is waiting. He's trying to force himself to hold off till 9:30 and I think this kind of reflects something, I hadn't thought about this at the time, but I think this kind of reflects something you were talking about a little bit earlier, of this feeling of having control of the situation. Wrestling control of it, that I'm going to arbitrarily tell myself that I can't eat any of this until 30 minutes from now. Why 30 minutes from now? I don't know, because it means that I still have some say over what's going on here.
Yeah. It also kind of reminds you of, I think, something you might have mentioned, where it's like you're telling yourself, like, all right, I just got to push hard for another, 30 minutes, just 30 minutes. Like, you can bite off 30 minutes in a way that you can't bite off 20 hours.
Yeah.
Get your hands around it. Yeah, I was also thinking about just the level of hunger that they ought to be feeling
Yeah.
after, eating very little and burning an absurd number of calories and not sleeping and all this. I think you'd be really hungry. I also think you'd be probably hallucinating, if we're being honest about like the situation. Because like I say that because I remember listening to an interview with one of these ultra marathoners, and I don't remember how long she had been awake, but she had like vivid visual hallucinations as she was on day 2 or 3 or whatever. Probably day 2. I don't think that a human being could actually do 3 days. But anyway, the maybe hallucinations will come at some point. It's fine. I'm not criticizing. It's just like in reality, I think he would start hallucinating at some point.
Yeah. I mean, I think I did a quick calculation while you were talking, and like, I think someone about Garrity's size walking 4 miles an hour burns about 400 calories an hour, which is just shy of 10,000 calories a day.
Uh-huh.
Definitely not even eating close to that amount in calories, right?
Right. Yeah, for sure.
So,
yeah. Yep.
and it is interesting though that like we didn't talk about this, but that one of the rules of the long walk is that you only get, like, you can ask for water whenever you want it. If you need a new canteen, you'll get a new canteen, but you get food one time, one point in the day, 9 a.m. every day. You get your belt of food, and that's all your food for the whole day, which is an interesting stipulation. Like they're pushing them, but they're also kind of starving them a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because they normally don't seem to go out of their way to make the race harder than it already is, but this is one way in which they do seem to be putting a little bit of pressure, because it's much more likely that you'll just collapse. Like your muscles will literally just collapse out of exhaustion. They won't be able to push anymore at a certain point.
And Matt, not long after 9 o'clock, the walkers pass the 100 miles walked point, which, by the way, puts them at an average pace of like 4.12 miles per hour. So they are walking a little bit faster than they need to.
That's so interesting.
Just a little bit. So at this 100-mile point, there's a huge crowd waiting for them. And the kind of absurdity of this huge crowd of people cheering them on kind of drives Garrity into a giggle fit. He loses control of himself and starts laughing uncontrollably, which almost gets him killed. And if not for Pete McVrees, it would have got him killed. It's Pete that saves him here. Pete that swoops in and picks him up and gets him walking again right after his third warning. Pete says, though, that this isn't musketeer shit. He owed Ray a favor. He's now repaid that favor, and they're even, and he won't do it again. What was your take on this kind of giggle fit that Garrity goes through?
I think he's just kind of losing his mind, partly just due to physical exhaustion, physical, mental exhaustion, not sleeping mainly.
Yeah.
And, on top of everything else, the not sleeping, right? Shit, man, like the couple of times in my life I've stayed up all night, I was already mentally out of it, right? And then you add the walking on top of it. I think your state of mind would just be totally deranged by this point.
Yeah.
I also don't believe Pete at all. I think that he loves Ray. I think that he would sacrifice his life for Ray.
Yeah. Well, we've already kind of seen it's bullshit, like later in these chapters, right? That he helps him again and again and again. Maybe not physically helps him, but he's there for him. He's supporting him. He's there for him.
I think that we'll get into this when we get into his story more, but I think that McVrees is a romantic, and that means he may say he's not going to do any of this musketeer shit, but it's like, yeah, you're totally like the fact that you reach for the musketeer reference, McVrees, means that you're thinking about the musketeers because you're romantic.
Sure, yeah. I really liked Olsen's reaction to this whole thing too. He's furious with Pete for doing this, and he like says over and over again that God will strike you down for what you did. So it's not just that I'm mad at you for what you did. What you did was a sin, was sacrilegious, was so evil by saving someone else, that God himself will punish you for it. I that's fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think Olsen's brain is also kind of breaking.
Yeah, for sure. But the framing of it in a religious context, I think, is really interesting. That in this world, like the godly thing to do would be to let your fellow man die to help the rest of us have a shorter walk.
Yeah. I guess if you, I think I was unfairly rounding that off as just like he's babbling, but you're right. I mean, the rational reason why you would say that is like, God damn it, you have now basically caused me to have to walk longer by saving one of my competitors.
By doing a thing that the Bible specifically tells you to do, right? To help the people out around you.
That's perfect.
Yeah. I also really like this part where McVree's like his kind of reaction to this whole thing is he's probably a little bit pissed off at himself, but he like goes and starts walking like directly behind Barkovich, just kind of staring him down, perhaps willing him to die, wanting to see him break and see this whole thing happen. Really, really fascinating stuff.
Yeah. I mean, McVree's is the most interesting character to me. I think, he wants there to be justice, right? And like Barkovich's mindless selfishness is an affront to him and his romantic nature. And that's like in the same way that Garrity has kind of chosen his nemesis, McVree's has chosen his, and his nemesis is Barkovich, because Barkovich is totally selfish and focused on winning, and it, like seems to enjoy it when others die. And this is just so repugnant to McVree's because he wants there to be, he wants there to be some reason for it all. For sure.
And interestingly enough, and I think intentionally, Barkovich has a pretty quiet few chapters this week, right? Ever since he, basically caused that other kid to get murdered, he really hasn't done much or said much. He's been pretty quiet. In fact, the only times we see him really talk this week is when he's chastising McVree's for like staring him down and like getting up in his shit.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I mean, McVree's almost has become the aggressor in a certain sense, because I think the wind is going to come out of Barkovich's sails, and it's like now Barkovich is almost a source of energy for McVree's, where he's like, McVree's is like, I just want to see this guy die, and then I'll be okay. Then I can die.
Yeah, that's kind of been his refrain, right? He's going to outwalk Barkovich, right? Yeah. He's, no matter what happens, he's going to outwalk Barkovich.
Yeah.
So Garrity kind of senses that the rest of the boys aren't really into speaking with him at the moment, and so he carefully drops back and has a nice friendly chat with Stebbins. By the way, just the idea that he's dropping back with 3 warnings is like fucking terrifying.
Yeah.
I'm going to slow down, but just enough to fall back to be in line with Stebbins, but not too far because I'll just be shot.
Yeah. Ugh. I mean, you could chalk it up to the sleep deprivation, but I do think that if we just look at how blasé he is about these things, it really does speak to this idea that Garrity just doesn't care about anything, doesn't care about his life. He doesn't have fear. He doesn't have hope. He's just, I got 3 warnings, but I want to talk to Stebbins though. I'm kind of bored.
So once again, Matt, Stebbins seems to be the one who like knows and understands the most about the walk itself. And so King kind of uses him as our exposition fairy here, filling in some information. Like the one question I think we had at the very beginning was, why isn't the walk, which is one of the most, if not the most popular sport in the country, televised? Why is this not on TV all the time? Why are people not watching it all the time? Why aren't more people out along the side of the road constantly cheering these people on? And we learn that actually all that will happen eventually, just not this soon. That part of the structure around this thing is that they wait until much further in the walk for the TV crews to get involved, for the crowds to really come into it. And this is an intentional decision made by the state to get to a point, at least Stebbins says, that the walkers no longer notice the crowd, that it no longer has an impact on them positively or negative. So once they've gotten to that mental state to where they are basically ignoring the people around them, that's when the people are allowed to come in full to this whole thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. That, I mean, if you were the psychopath designing this thing, then that would make sense. I mean, I think it's an interesting conversation just because Stebbins' attitude is what makes it interesting, because he doesn't refuse to answer. Like he's not blowing Garrity off. He's answering the questions, but he's just kind of barely, giving minimal answers. He's not interested in the conversation. It's just like very kind of, it's just a very interesting attitude. I don't know, for some reason it stuck with me that he said that televising the walk is discouraged. Like the word, he didn't say it was banned, he didn't say it was prohibited, he said it was discouraged. And I just love that word choice, assuming I remembered it correctly because I didn't go back and look. I love that word choice because it's just like such an insidious word. It's like, it's one thing for the state to ban something, it's another for it to just be, that's discouraged. We don't encourage that. Okay, shit, don't do that, do not do that.
Yeah. It's like, I will be very disappointed in you if we catch you doing that. Yeah, there's something so much more ominous and malicious about it. I agree. Like that, we don't have to prohibit anything. All we have to do is tell you we wouldn't like it if you did that, and that's enough to where you're not going to do it. Because obviously it is, right? Like they haven't. I think they've seen like a couple TV crews in big towns, but that's mostly it.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
And the other thing is, you have to wonder, like, is Stebbins giving these answers factually? Like, is he saying like he knows this and this is an intentional choice that he's aware of, or is he just making assumptions and talking about like his view on the government and the state is obviously a negative one, right? He doesn't seem to really like the major too much. He thinks this whole thing is bad and ridiculous, and yet obviously he's here still. So what a mystery of a character.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I'm just taking it as sort of exposition.
That's fair.
And that's just taking it at face value, but you could be right.
We also, Matt, finally learn a bit more about the capital P prize. Stebbins states here, when they ask me what I want for my prize, which seems to mean that on top of the money we know people get, the prize, capital P, is basically whatever in the world you want. So let's chat about that. That's interesting, right?
I mean, that's what it sounds like, which is insane, because it's like, what does that mean? Can you have a unicorn? I mean, seriously, like, is this a magic world where you get a wish? I don't think, nothing else magic about it, so I'm going to assume not. If not magic, then like, what are the limits? Like, can you have a pyramid the size of Nebraska erected in your, like, there's got to be some limits. And I mean, it could be one of these things where it's like the limits are like, you wouldn't dare ask for more than something reasonable, because you know how this world operates, and that's the limit, actually. Like the kind of person who wins a long walk is going to ask for something very reasonable because they understand what the score is.
Sure. No, that makes sense to me. I like this because, like, I don't know. Again, this might just be King's intentionally limited world building, but like, none of these kids have talked about previous winners, Like, nobody said like, oh yeah, when Joe Smith won, he asked for an airplane or something, like there's not any of that. And perhaps that is just, they don't talk about that while they're walking. And perhaps they don't know what happens to these walkers. That you talked about how there's this idea that King has put into the book that there are no winners to this thing, actually. And like, I think McVrees is the one that was convinced of that. And so even the winner doesn't actually win. And so maybe that's true, or maybe it's just, you just don't talk about what the prizes the winners get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the things that's weird, and that almost did make me think, like, is there something supernatural happening that, and that's why they're being weird about it? I don't really think it's supernatural, but it is weird that they wouldn't talk about that. I agree.
Sure. I really like this little paragraph here as well. In 23 minutes, he could drop a warning, but for now, he was still walking with 3. It didn't scare him the way he thought it would. There was still the unshakable blind assurances that this organism, Ray Garrity, could not die. The others could die. They were extras in the movie of his life, but not Ray Garrity, star of the long-running hit film The Ray Garrity Story. maybe he would eventually come to understand the untruth of that emotionally as well as intellectually. Maybe he was maybe that was the final depth of which Stebbins had spoken. It was a shivery, unwelcome thought. I love that whole thing so much, because I think there's something inherently relatable with that, right? Every human being thinks they are the protagonist of their own story.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's not true.
For most people, it's not.
Yeah, I mean, some people are protagonists, those bastards. But
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I like how this plays with what we were talking about a bit ago about like understanding versus not understanding death, and then furthermore whether that matters at all. Because one of the characters was like, yeah, I understand the concept of dying now, and then and Ray is basically like, I don't. That's basically what he's thinking here. Is he's thinking, I don't really understand the concept of ending. I don't think it's real fundamentally. I mean, I think it's very hard to the closest you ever get to realizing it's real is like literally almost getting hit by a car or something and being like, oh shit, that like I can see how that could have gone differently. But that doesn't happen very often, hopefully.
And I mean, and part of this is obviously just like human being survival mechanism, right? Like we all don't think we're going to die, despite the fact that we all know for a fact that we're all going to die. We don't behave that way in our everyday life. We can't. We would be non-functioning if so. And these kids are closer to death than most people are throughout their life, and even then they still, some of them at least, still push back against that idea. And Ray's doing that here. We are kind of seeing that start to collapse a little bit, right? Like he's starting to understand that that's an illusion. And I think what you said is so fascinating. Is like, does it matter? Does it ultimately matter? Whether or not people have understanding that they're going to die here or not?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in the course, like it is utterly irrelevant, because it's just like, you just got to keep your legs moving. All the rest of it, you're wasting calories with all that thinking. Just keep your legs moving.
So we see here, in a desperate attempt to survive, a walker rushes the half track begging for help. The guards push him off and they run over his fucking legs. And then on top of this, they count out his 3 warnings one by one over the course of 2 minutes. And then shoot him after that. And this like slavish dedication to the rules is probably one of the most horrifying things we've seen so far, right? Like the idea that he's run over his legs, he's done, let's just shoot him. And they won't do that they still will count out his warnings for him, one every 30 seconds. And then shoot him is horrifying. Absolutely horrifying.
I actually thought this was one of the more genuinely horrifying things from a King book, full stop. I was gonna say I love it. I found it upsetting, right? Because it's like, it's a fantastically crafted sequence, because it's like you've got this, the whole situation is horrifying, first of all. Then you've got this kid who just mentally breaks and he's like begging like, my feet hurt, and then like in that delightful irony, perfect Stephen King irony, what happens? His legs get crushed, his feet are now pulverized. He's still screaming about his feet, perhaps not even realizing that they've been pulverized. By the way, of course it had to be a half track, right? Like why not? Because like in the back of my mind, I think I was thinking like, why not just have it be a Jeep? Why is it a half track? Oh, so they can crush somebody. That, of course, makes perfect sense. Because you imagine a half track going over somebody's legs, that's a very different matter from imagining a car tire. And then like you just said, the countdown. I know I'm going through this laboriously, but like sequencing wise, it's just horrible. It's amazing.
No, you're right. And importantly, it disturbs the fuck out of Raymond Garrity too. Like he is legitimately horrified by this whole thing. Perhaps part of this is realizing the fragility of this whole thing, and this kid probably thought he was the star in his own story too. And he starts kind of losing it. And then Pete is here again, Matt, despite the fact that he said he was done and he wouldn't be helping him again. Pete is there trying to distract Garrity from thinking about the kid and his smashed legs. He has him talk about his girl Jan and gets him to talk about this whole thing, distracting him. So once again, our musketeer is back to help our boy.
Yep. Love that Pete. Yep. I mean, but both of these guys really care about each other. It's not just that Pete, loves Garrity. I think Garrity cares about him quite a lot at this point. Which is, that's why I'm afraid these two are going to be the last two standing, because then that one of them is going to have to, either willingly or unwillingly be the sacrifice.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the tragic, like the tragedy built into the story, right? That like every time you see these guys help each other and care for each other, you're like, fuck yeah. And yet what's waiting for them at the end.
Yeah.
One of these kids is going to have to die, or both of them.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So the talk about Jan gets Peter McVrees talking about his past. He finally tells the story of his scar and his girl Priscilla. There's a lot to talk about here. There's so much. We're going to spend probably 20 minutes talking about this whole story, but I want to talk about this part here at the beginning because I love this quote so much. J.D. Salinger, John Knowles, even James Kirkwood, and that guy Don Bredes. They've destroyed being an adolescent, Garrity. If you're a 16-year-old boy, you can't discuss the pains of adolescent love with any decency anymore. You just come off sounding like fucking Ron Howard with a heart on, which is that's our Happy Days reference.
Okay.
Wow. This speaks to me of Stephen King working out some demons. Yes, I think.
I totally agree. This is a moment where I felt like King is sort of looking at us and going, what the fuck do you want me to say? These guys have already done the best job you could do at what I'm about to attempt. Or something along those lines.
Sure.
And then of course, and then he's saying like, and here I go. I'm going to tell my own story of adolescent woe that involves textiles, of course, because it's Stephen King.
He even has McVrees like up on the 5th floor throwing shit at rats, and I'm like, oh, was this the idea for Graveyard Shift, or had you already written Graveyard Shift when you wrote this?
That's the greater King-verse connection right there.
So the short version of the story is that he and his girlfriend moved out to Newark when they were presumably, I think we're meant to understand that Pete McVrees is one of the older boys here, probably 18, because I think they had both graduated at least. They move out to Newark and get jobs at textile plants. We learn that she excelled in her job. He did not, and this sparks a lot of jealousy in him. They got in a fight, and he tried to sleep with her, and she slashed his face wide open. Pete is like convinced that he wasn't trying to rape her, but here, word of advice for people. If you go to sleep with someone and they cut your face open with a knife, you were probably trying to rape him. I mean, right? Like there's a lot going on here in the subtext of what Pete is saying, I think.
It's interesting because like the phrase "tried to sleep with her" is perfectly vague. Like it doesn't describe any actions. It describes intent. And it's like, well, what did you do though exactly?
Yeah. And he yada yadas over the part where she goes and gets a knife and cuts his face open. Yeah. Like something happened there.
I mean, like I think the way he wants you to imagine it is like he put his hand on her shoulder and she immediately grabbed the knife and slashed his face open.
Yeah.
Which maybe that's what happened, because we don't know. But I agree with you that the subtext is kind of there to be read.
Yeah, I mean, like because the context of the story is they're in the middle of this huge fight, right? Uh-huh. Like that this thing has been building up over the months that they lived out there, where he is not doing well, he is not happy, he is not succeeding, and he is seeing her as a person who is doing well at her job, and is becoming, in his mind, she's becoming miserly, she's becoming obsessed with money, like all of these things. And then it just says, and then so I tried to sleep with her because we were in her apartment for the first time, and the only other times we got to sleep together was in this car, and I had stopped sleeping with her because I hate myself and I could tell she hated me. And then suddenly I just tried to sleep with her in the middle of this knockdown, drag out fight, and then I got my face slashed open. But it definitely wasn't rape. And it's like, oh, okay, buddy.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's like, okay, the actual moment to moment mechanics of like, all right, let's stop arguing now and have sex. Sound good? Mm-hmm. Like that's not a
let's do it. Yeah. maybe you're just not in the mood after a fight like that. And I mean, this is really interesting because he kind of concludes the story by saying this. He says, "She seems very small to me now, very far away. Pris at this point in my life is no more than a speck on the horizon. She really was mental, Ray. Something, her mother maybe. Her mother was a lush. Something had fixed her on the subject of money. She was a real miser. Distance lends perspective, they say. Yesterday morning, Pris was still very important to me. Now, she's nothing." Um,
Well,
I kind of want to innately push back at his view of her and wonder if this is a really accurate depiction of this woman. Very possible that she got obsessed with money, became a miser, and became a real jerk. Also very possible that he's feeling this intense amount of emasculation at the fact that she is excelling and he isn't. And
yeah.
he creates a image of a person that she is not and puts it on her. And we don't know either way, but it feels like that's what's in the subtext that we're doing here.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that he's kind of making a lot of his own self-hatred and feeling of inadequacy be about her because, you know, like in his own mind, in his own narrative, he did this kind of for her and to be with her. And it's like, well, he sucks at his job, actually. She's really good at hers. Everybody doesn't like him. Everybody does like her. And it's like he kind of is beginning to hate her, actually. And it's hard for him to, like, he doesn't know how to square that. And he makes it all, again, he makes it be like, oh, this is a Pris problem. And it's like, this kind of sounds like more of a McBreeze problem that you have chosen, that you've, it's interesting because you've said a few things here that have actually kind of discombobulated my read on him, which was previously rather clean in the sense of being straightforward. Like I saw him as a romantic who made wild, stupid life decisions because like the story of it appealed to him, really very much like a younger Matt Freeman. And then, like, you know, he tried to make grand gestures. The universe slapped him down for it because the universe doesn't work that way. Doesn't really care how deep your feelings are. It only cares how many bags of textiles you can pack or whatever. And the net result is he feels this profound sense of injustice and shame. And again, like you were saying, I think he kind of projects that onto her and says like, oh, it's her and money and her, and she cut my face. And it's like, that you kind of did all this to yourself. And I think like he kind of knows that, and like that's why he chose to commit suicide by going on the walk.
That is, to me, one of the most interesting parts about him, because I agree with you. Throughout his story, he seems sufficiently self-deprecating to understand that a lot of what happened here was his fault. That is his own personal problems, his being kind of a piece of shit that wasn't doing well at his job, recognizing all his failures. And then that paragraph that I just read is what he caps off the story on, where he says, you know, not only that she's small to me, she's very far away. This experience has made me not care about her anymore. She's nothing to me now. But then he has to also get in this little bit here in the middle of that. She really was mental. She was a miser. She was fucked up. And it's almost a contradiction, right? Like, yesterday morning, she was very important to me. Now she's nothing. But the last thing I want to leave you with about her is that this was actually kind of all her fault, that she was really just broken in the brain, which is like, I mean, again, a very natural young person thing to do. Of, you break up with someone, it's a rough breakup, and it's very easy to just pocket them in your mind as, oh, that person was just like, something's wrong with them, and so I can move on from them now because this doesn't reflect on me at all. It was just something was wrong with them, and I'm just going to carry on. Very, very relatable action for sure.
Yeah,
but it does reflect on him and where he is right now, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think the metaphor I'm going to reach for is like, it's not even that big of a reach, actually. If we're going to like how these people would have lived their lives, it's like, okay, well, you imagine a guy who gets divorced and it's messy, and then he makes the entire rest of his life be about that and about, you know, that woman and what she what she did to me
Yeah.
and what
Yeah.
she took from me. Like, this is a very common kind of human being, you know, and it's always disappointing because it's like just like you were half of that equation, obviously. Anyway, the I agree that it's interesting that we end the story with this capper, right?
Yeah.
It seems like maybe he hasn't quite come to terms with it, and maybe will not. Maybe he is not destined to really fully understand his own responsibility in that situation.
Yeah. I don't know if I really legitimately believe someone saying that this person is no longer important to me. She's just a speck on the horizon. I don't need that mental dig at her
Yeah.
mental health. That's not a necessary thing anymore.
Yeah, that makes sense. But just for reference, though, surefire solution for getting over your ex is to put yourself into a death race where you're definitely going to die within the next day or so.
Brilliant. There you go. The final piece of the getting over it puzzle is the long walk.
Yep.
All right. So let's move on to our final chapter of the week, chapter 9. This chapter begins with Garrity taking inventory once again. They have walked 115 miles. All his warnings are gone. He's got 3 to spare. He's hurting. He's hurting quite a bit, but he's still going strong, Matt. Here we go.
All right.
I want to talk about the significance of the walk being volunteer, because at this moment, someone says, I hope we see the Major because I want to tell him what I think of him. And Garrity says, our perfect little boy of the state, Garrity, you've got no right to hate the Major. He didn't force you. Force me. He's killing me. That's all. It's still not. And then he gets interrupted. So let's talk about this, because this is something that's really interesting, right? That separates us from our other kind of dystopian contest fiction we talked about in our discussion question a couple weeks ago. This is, from everything we've seen, a completely volunteer thing, that no one is forcing any of these kids to join the long walk. There's not a lottery that picks them. They sign up. They are allowed to back out up to a certain time. This is totally up to them. So that's unique, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, presumably there's more than 100 kids who are interested in it every year. Otherwise they wouldn't make the quota, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, it is like so this occurred to me as I was thinking about this. If there really was a long walk in our world, do you think it would get 100 volunteers per year?
100%.
I agree. and I think that's like, it's while you're reading the book, you're like, this is so fantastical. But then I sat back and I was like, it's not that fantastical.
Mm-hmm.
Like I can and I guess that's the point, is like you can totally imagine that a society would have a thing like this that was exactly this brutal and horrible, and just kind of continue to function around that without it having a noticeable impact or making things that different.
Yeah. And to me, it almost reflects a more powerful state than if it was, lottery based or forced into it, right?
Yeah.
That they don't need to force people to do this, that they have such control over the mood of the populace that this can be a thing that we do for our main source of entertainment is murdering 99 children.
Yeah.
And we have no problem finding volunteers for this.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Because I totally agree. That the volunteer element makes it part of society rather than part of the state, you could say.
Yeah, it's Brave New World versus 1984, right?
Yes, love that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So our friend, good old Scram, has a fever now, and he's not doing too well, Matt. But no one is as bad as Olsen, who we see has kind of completely retreated all the way in himself. He's not responding to anyone. He's not talking. He's just kind of a shell of a person, but somehow still walking. Matt, did you ever think this kid was going to get this far? And I wonder how much longer you think Olsen has.
Well, that's that. I think, like I said earlier, I think he's going to get shockingly far, and I think that's the point. Is like there's no rhyme or reason to these things. That the big, healthy, strong guy can get knocked down by a cramp, while the guy who, by all rights, by all reason, ought to be dead,
Mm-hmm.
makes it to the end. I would not be altogether surprised if Olsen actually won, because that would be one point that you could make, right? It could be
Mm-hmm.
like it doesn't matter how anything seems, or if you have the right idea or the right justification or the right mindset, or if you've trained properly. Life is not fair.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I don't really think he's going to win. But I just um, yeah, he's much like Garrity. He is like the ultimate in just putting one foot in front of the other.
Yeah. I really like the way this paragraph is written here. He looked over at Olsen. Olsen was there. His tongue was turning blackish. His face was dirty. His eyes stared blindly. I'm not like him. Dear God, not like him. Please, I don't want to go out like Olsen. There's a lot there, but I think my favorite sentence in here is Olsen was there.
Uh-huh.
You know? Like, seemingly superfluous, right? He looked over at Olsen. You could just go, his tongue was turning blackish, his face was dirty, his eyes stared blindly. But King puts another sentence in there.
Uh-huh.
He looked over at Olsen. Olsen was there. He was, technically, but also that's kind of implying, because we have to take the time to point out that Olsen was there, we're also kind of saying that he almost isn't there anymore.
Yeah, I like that. It's like firmly establishing, like, yeah, he still exists despite all odds. The shock of just the mere fact that he's there has to be emphasized. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. I also really like this part where Garrity is thinking back to a conversation he had with Jan before the walk started. And I pulled this out just simply because, I think there's part of me that, at least on this reread, was like, is he overplaying how important their relationship is? And he certainly is, right? I think he's even admitted that to himself. But part of you wondered, is like, is she really even as into him as he thinks she is? Because, and I love that this is here, because he's talking to her and he's saying, I have to go. I have to. Don't you understand? I have to. And she says, Ray, you don't understand what you're doing. Ray, please don't. I love you. So, like, I think that is important to say, that, like, while he is building her up as like a totem, she's still really into him, and like tried to convince him to not do this. And she couldn't. And he couldn't even give her a straight answer as to why he was doing it. Just, I have to.
Yeah. I got the sense that she really does care about him quite a lot.
Yeah.
I personally, one pet peeve is when the idea that 16-year-olds can really experience love is sort of tossed aside as like, it's just puppy love. It's like I that's annoying to me. I think that she could very well love him very, very much.
Sure.
And it kind of seems like she does. It sounds like they had a really delightful, sweet relationship that could have blossomed into something more mature eventually. But as it was something beautiful.
Yeah, and I mean, like, this is, again, to go back to our military metaphor, a conversation that probably happens all the time between loved ones, when one person has signed up to go into the military. It's like, I don't understand. Help me understand why you're doing this. And he doesn't have an answer for her. And how frustrating that must be for her. Like, he's kind of building up this meeting they're going to be having in Freeport. Is she going to be like, what is her state of mind at that point, right? Because her state of mind right here in this flashback is, this is murder. Like, what they're going to murder you. And you can't explain to me why you're doing this. And so she's going to see him, possibly, and see him, this incredibly broken, beaten man, and be like, what was this all for? And doesn't get it. And that's, people have motivation to do a lot of things, but there's a lot of men that join the military that perhaps can't explain why they're doing it, and can't explain it to the person that they love the most.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, my assumption was that she's not even going to be there. not because she doesn't care about him, but because it's too painful. And
Yeah.
Like in his sort of in his world, you know, in that long running Raymond Garrity story, like she's a side character whose function is to be there to support him at that particular place where they agreed. And it's like, well, from her point of view, this is this guy she really cares about who's killing himself in slow motion. Why would she want to be there to see that when she doesn't have to be? I don't know. We'll see whether she shows up or not. But,
yeah, no, I think that's we'll definitely see there.
Yeah.
And I think that read is correct. So we'll find out.
Yep.
So the text really starts to lose it here as the walk continues, Matt. There are moments of lucidity from our main character, but the walkers kind of continue to trudge on, mostly in silence. There's the occasional conversation is struck up, but the heat of the day mixed with their exhaustion really at this point begins to wear our characters down.
Yeah, they seem to be losing, or rather, I felt like I was losing track of space and time, and I think that that is because Garrity is losing track of space and time. His mental state is deteriorating. He is retreating more into himself for these sort of ruminations. This is, I think, you know, considering the sleep deprivation, everything else we've talked about, I think it's reasonable. I'm curious to see how much worse this sort of thing gets. Like, is the prose itself going to become a, you know, incoherent fever dream at some point? I'm not sure. We'll see.
We will. And then the watermelon man comes, Matt. Dom Leantio, the little Italian man, attempts to get some watermelon, but he is disallowed by the police. But that doesn't stop him, Matt, as he pushes through and tosses some watermelon to the walkers. Not everyone catches some, but they all share it anyway, and it seems like everybody but Stebbins gets a piece. This seems like, in the moment, the type of thing that will end up being this important symbolic moment for our walkers. So let's spend some time talking about it, Matt.
Yeah, I do agree that the watermelon is a symbol. It's like this pure, simple goodness of a sweet, cold treat in the midst of this horrible ordeal.
Yeah.
It's a kind of grace. It's a kind of unexpected, undeserved, good thing that falls into the middle of this nightmare. Even if it doesn't really help in the sense of changing the outcome, because, you know, still only one of them can survive. The watermelon didn't change that. It does make the burden easier to bear in that moment.
Yeah, and you have to wonder, like, if going into symbols and metaphor again, this is the state that is specifically forbidden this kind of assistance, and yet the people push back and fight back and succeed. The state fails, right? The state fails to prevent this intrusion and prevent these kids from getting this sweet, delicious, wonderful treat. And so that is a failure of the government to stop this from happening. Now, you could be an optimist and say, like, look, that hope and sweetness and kindness prevails in spite of this horrible, horrible, monstrous system. You can say that, or you can be a pessimist and say, it doesn't matter. They're still all going to die. Some of them will just have a little piece of watermelon in their tummy when it happens. I don't know which it is, but I certainly want it to be the former.
I mean, I think the way that the scene plays out says a lot of stuff about this. I mean, so it's like, for example, the way the cops behave. Like, the text is very clear that the cops are not, you know, squatties. They're not these soldiers. They're not these murderers. They're basically just what we think of as cops. They're just kind of guys doing their job, and they're kind of like embarrassed that they have to be doing this, because they're like, I don't really want to keep the kids from having the watermelon either, but it's the rules. And that's an interesting statement about the way the society works, where it's like they're not that they maybe the society doesn't have as thorough of a buy-in into the idea of like what the walk is. For them, they're okay. They've accepted the existence of the walk, but maybe they haven't fully accepted certain aspects of it. I don't know exactly what to say there, but
no, I like that. I like that a lot. Also, I just want to say the way King writes this watermelon it feels like it's the most delicious tasting watermelon that's ever existed on the face of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And I immediately got hungry for some watermelon.
Yeah, my mouth got watery right when you talked about the watermelon. Yeah.
And I will say that like this is a thing in I'm going to talk about my marathon again, Matt, but this is like a thing because I have this very distinct memory. It's mile 23 of my marathon. So I have a 5K left and I crest the top of a hill and I'm exhausted because my calf is injured, got hurt 6 miles ago, and I'm basically run limping into my marathon. And I crest the top of this hill and there's just a guy with a table sitting by the side of the road, and he's got some golden Oreos there. I don't know if you know what golden Oreos are, but they're Oreos but with a vanilla cookie instead of a chocolate cookie. And they suck. They're awful. They're shitty. Why would you ever not want a chocolate Oreo? But I had run 23 miles and I was really tired, and that was the most delicious thing I have ever eaten in my entire life. My body was craving energy, and I put direct sugar into it, and it was like, yup, let's go. And that one golden Oreo got me through the next 3.2 miles. So the power, the totemic power of a sweet treat at this moment is, I think, not lost on me, and I think it's a wonderful moment in the story.
That's perfect. Yeah, the closest analog I have is going on keto and not having any sugar or bread or fruit or anything for like 24 hours, and then having like half an apple, and the apple is just the sweetest. The apple is sweeter than any ice cream you've ever had, because your body's like, I would kill a person for sugar right now.
Yeah, your body like really becomes desensitized to sugar if you have a lot of it, right? It just gets used to it. And then if you cut that off for a while and then have something that's not even that sugary, you're just like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Give me all of it.
Totally.
Don't send me any emails about how good golden Oreos are. You're wrong. You're absolutely wrong.
Yeah, just in that one situation.
And you know how I know? Because I was like, oh wow, maybe I like golden Oreos. And then I went out a week later and bought a sleeve of golden Oreos. No, they sucked.
Yeah.
Who wants a vanilla Oreo?
I don't mind them, honestly, but
it's very upsetting. Oreos are America's favorite cookie, Matt. Why would you fuck with that?
I know. I mean, Oreos are pretty perfect as they are. I agree with that.
Yeah. And you know how I know it's America's favorite cookie?
What?
Because it says so on the packaging.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
They can't put that on there if it's not true.
That would be false advertising.
Yeah. All right. So we move on from our watermelon man. And as our walkers continue, a storm is starting to grow in the air, which they're blissfully awaiting because the heat of the day. I think it's really great here that like it's 80 degrees. That's something that kind of in his stupor, Raymond Garrity is saying over and over again, that it's only 80. Like it gets much hotter than that in Maine. And you and I growing up in Texas, we know that 80 is actually kind of a nice day in the summer in Texas.
Absolutely.
But to these kids with the sun shining down and 28 hours of walking nonstop, 80 is a scorcher.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, like the dehydration becomes a massive risk if you're actually like physically hot on top of the fact that you're exerting yourself. Because it really doesn't take much for your body to need to start sweating a lot.
Yeah.
And then once you start sweating a lot, I mean, that's one thing I was thinking about actually, was like, I bet they're like, salt, what's the word? Whatever. They need to be taking salt.
Electrolytes.
They're electrolytes. There you go. Because if you're just drinking water and you're eating your snacks and you're sweating, you're gonna cramp up real bad. We'll see if
Gatorade.
They do. They need some Gatorade.
Did Gatorade exist when this book was written?
I don't know. Good question.
Introduced September 9th, 1965. So technically, yes.
Technically, yes. Well, we'll see if Gatorade shows up.
So I really love this quote here. There was an electric tension in the air now, something about the storm poised above them, and something more, Garrity could not fathom it. When he blinked his eyes, he seemed to see the out-of-kilter eyes of freaky D'Alessio looking back at him from the darkness. So there's your hallucinating starting to happen.
That's true. That's true. Do you think the phrase "the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg" every time you hear "the eyes of freaky D'Alessio"?
I do not.
Do you know what I'm referencing?
Yeah, that's Gatsby, right?
Gatsby.
Yeah.
I just remember that the symbol of the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg was slammed into our heads in whatever year of English that was, and so every time we hear about the eyes of freaky D'Alessio, I think I involuntarily think that sentence.
No, that's great. Yeah, that was one of those like, this is clearly a symbol, so we will use it to teach you about symbols.
Right. What's funny is
we definitely had that pounded into our heads.
I remember that conversation, but I can't remember what it was a symbol for. So
you know, you said that and I laughed, and then I was like, wait.
It's a symbol for watching.
Yeah. So the conversation moves back to death again as Baker talks about people's preferred method of burial, a morbid but immediate conversation for what these kids are facing. I love how he talks about, that he's from Louisiana where they have to have above ground graves. But it makes you kind of wonder, like, one thing we've seen is that these kids are shot and kind of dragged off the road. Are their bodies returned to their families or not? What happens here? Are they the honored dead? What do you think in this world the dead of the Long Walk are treated like?
I would guess that they are, since we have this whole military metaphor going and all this military imagery around the whole thing. I would expect they would be treated the same way as like a military casualty. That would be my inclination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that certainly would be in line with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we have to talk about this line, Matt. I could see him worrying a hole in my own coffin, then making it bigger, finally wriggling through and going right for my eyes like they was jujubes. So that's talking about rats getting into coffins, and that's why all the people in Louisiana have lead-lined coffins, so they can't have rats dig through them. But the most important thing here, of course, is that our good pal Jim Cameron clearly stole this line for Avatar right from Richard Bachman. Yeah. Can't believe it.
Yeah, I think the character of what is it, Quaritch? He must be a Stephen King fan, something like that.
Yeah, he must have read The Long Walk.
It would make sense, right? He seems like the Major in a sense.
I mean, maybe that's Cameron's intent here. He's given a sly wink to us King fans here. I don't know. I mean, it's very possible that multiple people could have a similar sentiment of that eyes are like jujubes, but I read this line having, we just watched Avatar not too long ago, and it's like, oh my God.
I think
Eat your eyes for jujubes.
I think I've heard the word jujubes twice in my life. And one of those times was in Avatar, and the other time was here. And I'm, to be completely honest with you, Scott, not entirely sure what a jujube is.
It's a candy. It's like a chewable sugar candy.
But isn't it also a fruit? Isn't it like a fruit and then it became a candy?
I don't know about that. Probably. I just know it as a little candy. All right, Matt, we're back. What our viewers/listeners don't know is that in the middle of our jujube conversation, Jim Cameron just killed your internet.
Yeah. Drove to my house, yanked the plug out of the wall, said, don't you fucking talk about the jujubes.
We lost your recording, so luckily we had a backup. I don't know how different this episode's going to sound, but if you're 2 hours into the episode now and the whole time been wondering why it sounds slightly different, here's the explanation. You get it right here in the middle.
That's always how I like things to go.
All right, Matt, let's go ahead and wrap this thing up. We were basically almost done when Jim Cameron rudely ruined it all for us, but
yes.
The chapter ends with the rainstorm finally coming. It starts as a regular just rain, and then it whips up further into a hailstorm that gets a few people their ticket. And the chapter ends as the rain keeps coming down with some expectation King is creating for us here that this rain is not going away anytime soon.
Yes, and that sucks.
Yeah. Well, it's the perfect like twist of the knife, right? Because the thing they were begging for, like the storm was approaching all day, and they were so hot, and they wanted it, and then like it cleared up a little bit, and I love. We haven't talked about this much, but the repeated beat of everyone like hating Maine
Yeah.
and being like, Garrity, what the fuck is this place?
Yeah.
It is really great. And then it finally comes, and of course, it's immediately the thing that is what they were asking for is immediately the thing that they hate.
Yeah, that's great. Also, I love the way King does weather and the way that he uses weather in his stories as like a metaphor for the uncontrollable chaos of reality.
Mm-hmm. No, it's great. It's great. And you can imagine after 30 hours of walking what being pelted by hail feels like.
Yeah.
Just can't imagine how awful that is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is it for this week. We will find out who survives the brainstorm next week as we continue the long walk with chapters 10 through 13. Matt, this is actually going to be our penultimate episode next week. We've only got 2 more weeks worth of chapters coming. So we're getting near the end now.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah. All right, let's move into our discussion question. Matt, what was last week's discussion question?
What's your favorite example of naturalistic writing, such as we talked about during that week's episode? And folks,
our bad.
We know, like, I think I knew that there's like a technical thing that is naturalistic writing.
Yeah.
I just kind of meant anything in the space of the vibe that this book puts off. So nobody, everybody did a great job with their answers. A lot of people were a lot more kind of strict with their answers than I felt like they needed to be, but that's fine. Bonus points to you. Anyway, do you keep on troshin says, for my GSCE English literature, one of the texts we studied was also one of Cy King's favorites, Lord of the Flies. The boys on the island begin as innocents, but as more time passes and the more their characters are influenced by their ongoing struggle for survival and the differences between each other, which only get exaggerated as the book goes on. I guess you could also take the TV show Lost as an example of naturalism in screenwriting, in particular the character of John Locke.
I wouldn't know that because someone won't do a Lost podcast with me. And as we both know, I'm not allowed to read or watch anything.
That's right.
That we don't do a podcast on.
Or think about your memories of having watched it.
No, not allowed.
Right.
No, that's a great answer, though. I like that.
Yeah.
Pear Jane says the first book to come to mind is Janet Finch's White Oleander. It's a Los Angeles coming-of-age story about 12-year-old Astrid, whose mother Ingrid, a famous poet, murders her boyfriend and is sent to prison. Astrid spends the next 6 years moving from foster family to foster family throughout the Los Angeles metro area, and if I had any artistic talent, I'd be able to draw detailed pictures of every single one of those homes. I know how they smell, what they sound like, what her foster mothers and siblings looked like. I know how Astrid's appearance evolves through each home and what her mother's prison feels like. Astrid is an artist herself, and by the end, when she's aged out of foster care and is living on her own, she constructs a series of suitcase-based art pieces which, when opened, visually reveal the spirit of each of her foster mothers, ranging from neglectful to abusive to loving to opportunistic. It's a stunning book and worthy of a reread and discussion. If it had any science fiction in it, I'd nominate it for the Doof Book Club, Jane says. You're not noticing a trend there, are you? Yeah, I noticed that as well.
It's not our fault. I mean, we just pick the options that everyone votes on.
I always pick at least one option that is not science fiction or fantasy every month, and it's never the one that wins.
Yeah, don't blame me. I voted for Kodos. This sounds really interesting and literary and rich and emotional and so forth.
I've heard of White Oleander. I've never read it, and I feel like I need to.
Yeah, me too. All right, Baby Can You Dig Your Sam says, I read Of Mice and Men in the 10th grade and fell deeply in love with this tragic story. Depression-era BFFs George and Lenny dream of a better life where they own a little piece of land that is all their own. But alas, 'twas not to be. Lenny does not understand society's pecking order, the dangers of a flirtatious woman, and his own strength. Although George has spent his life taking care of his friend, he knows all too well that what society has in store for Lenny, prompting a devastating mercy killing. Poignant and heart-wrenching and pessimistic. So true, so damn true.
It's been so long since I've read Of Mice and Men. I feel like I need to read it again.
I never actually read it. I just watched the movie.
God, maybe that's true for me too. I'm trying to think. I don't know. I honestly don't know if I've read the book or it's just the movie.
I mean, I love the movie. I also saw an opera version of it one time.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
How was that?
Very bizarre. And it was probably the only opera I've ever seen, which like in person. Strange, bizarre. I don't know why you would do that, but I mean, I'm not saying it was bad. Like, it was definitely of mice and men. It was just an opera.
I feel like I've never seen opera before, and I feel like that's weird. I feel like I should have seen opera.
Yeah, I mean, this was a date. This was not something that I wanted to do. So it's interesting. It's a very cool. The singing is super impressive if you're at all into singing as an art form.
Yeah. I need to go to an opera.
Yeah.
I'm gonna make that my goal for the next decade. One opera.
There you go. That's great.
Steve Liveroom says, I'm going to cheat and use a real life example. The World's Toughest Race on Amazon Prime shows teams competing for 5 to 11 days, paddling, running, biking, climbing, rappelling, navigating, paddleboarding, and more through 500 miles in and around Fiji. The character comes out of people when confronting extreme fatigue, lack of sleep, and battling all of the elements, paddling in the ocean at night, wading through a 40-degree river for hours, slogging bikes up an almost impossibly muddy hill, extreme heat. I cannot recommend the show enough. The team and individual stories are so compelling, and the scenery from Fiji is mind-blowing. It's like The Long Walk without the dystopia.
Delightful.
Sounds miserable.
Yeah. I love these. It is kind of interesting to consider. We asked earlier if The Long Walk were real, would there be volunteers? And reminding me of the existence of reality television makes me think, oh yes, there would definitely be sufficient volunteers, especially if it were televised, and they just make it into reality TV.
Well, and it's like like climbing Everest, right, where you're risking your life. But I mean, the difference between climbing Everest and The Long Walk is that, like, if a few people in your party can't make it to the top, they hopefully just go down below the death zone and they don't just get shot and have to remain on them. Like, there is extreme sports and extreme, like, and the pushing yourself to these extreme levels, but like the death is not quite as built into it as the walk is. But certainly you're putting yourself in a situation where death is a real possibility.
True. It's true. It's just it's a gradient. It's not a hard line. All right, Aqua Lungfish says the novel Hatchet by Gary Paulson. Oh, I remember that one. It's one of my favorite young adult novels growing up. It tells the story of a young boy, 13 or so if memory serves, who crashes in the Canadian wilderness after the pilot of a single-engine plane he was on had a massive heart attack and dies. He ends up in and subsequently next to an L-shaped lake where he has to stay for several months trying to survive. Most of the book is spent describing the ways he goes about his survival, from learning to fish and trap, learning to clean and cook food he either catches or forages for, and learning how to build a pretty dang good shelter. Among all these events are scattered ways the world tries to screw him over, from endless mosquitoes to a skunk spraying him, all the way to an actual tornado touching down. If I understand naturalism right, then this fits the dual definition of A, being a straightforward descriptive tale of a person doing things, and B, having the universe dictate what they can and can't do by being outside of their control. This book has stood out to me for years for a few reasons, the biggest being that it's actually pretty useful information. I learned about refraction of light from this book, why he can't seem to aim at fish correctly until he puts the tip of the spear in the water. I learned why you have a smoke hole in a shelter, and many other things. It served my Boy Scout days well. P.S. Did you know there were 4 sequels to this book? Brian's Winter is good. The River is okay, and the other 2 I'd never heard of until refreshing my memory on some of the stuff in order to write this. Well, Aqua Lungfish, we appreciate you providing the definition of naturalism, because we sure didn't. But I feel like it's close enough that shouldn't feel too embarrassed.
Do you know The Hatchet was written in 1986?
I did not.
It felt to me like one of those books that was like always around.
Yeah. I agree that I have the feeling that it felt like a book from, I don't know, Hemingway years or whatever. But no, it's Yeah, we had to read that in school. It affected me quite a bit. I probably don't remember it very clearly, but it definitely affected me very.
Yeah, I remember really enjoying it, but I really have no specific memories of it anymore. But I knew there was one sequel. I didn't know there were there were 4 sequels.
Did they all begin with him being in some situation and then accidentally ending up trapped in the wilderness?
That would probably get pretty old, where he's probably like, oh, geez.
Yeah.
I gotta have my trusty hatchet.
Yeah. I hope he keeps the hatchet.
Hope we learn how the hatchet got his whip and hat. All right. Gerardo says, if memory serves, it's been mentioned on the show that Cy King is more true to his characters and their natural development in the story than he is to holding on to his preconceived plot. He's especially good at writing the perspectives of children. With that in mind, I think I'm relying more on the movie adaptation for my example, but I believe The Body / Stand By Me is a great exposition of naturalistic characters. The boys are just boys, through and through. They're all dealing with problems from home, up against changing lives and growing pains. It's a rough stage for kids, but these kids especially. They come together and bond through roughhousing, teasing, and a grand adventure that binds them together. Nothing seems forced about the characters or friendships, about their actions or reactions. It's exactly how you would expect kids to behave. It's a masterclass of characterization, and it translates into a movie that becomes timeless.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what makes me happy, Matt? That you can now say, yeah, I've seen that, and I agree.
Yeah. We've come so far, haven't we?
It's not something you could have said 3 years ago.
It's true. It's true. Yeah.
No, that's a great answer. I like
we
that.
We talked about that one. That was over on the Other Levels of the Tower feed, though, right?
I believe that was our first Other Levels of the Tower.
Okay, cool. Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Tin Bugdock says, by my interpretation of naturalistic writing, the story I have enjoyed the most is Hemingway's The Snows of Kilimanjaro. The somber tone also pairs well with the mood of The Long Walk. It has some of my favorite lines of any of Hemingway's works and is good to reread from time to time whenever you need to reflect on what you're doing with your life and what it all means anyway. I think Harry would have made an excellent Long Walk participant, reminiscing about lost friends and loved ones and unwritten stories of the other walkers. My mind also drifts frequently to the opening line about the frozen leopard near the summit of Kilimanjaro. I learned a few years back that the leopard was a real thing, found in the 1920s and apparently known to Hemingway. I hope no one has yet explained what it was seeking at that altitude. The story is better if we are left to ponder our own explanations for that fact. Now I am off to reread Ray Bradbury's Kilimanjaro Machine. After reading the first always puts me in the mood to read the latter. R.I.P. Papa. I've never read either of those, so this is one of those moments where I feel literarily inadequate.
I agree. I mean, I've definitely heard of Snows of Kilimanjaro before. I haven't read too much Hemingway, actually. I feel like I need to read more Hemingway.
Yeah, especially after
Yeah. I feel like I had read most of Ray Bradbury's work, but I've never even heard of Kilimanjaro Machine. So I'm feeling definitely inadequate right now.
Yeah, I agree. I've never heard of it. That's interesting.
All right, last we have eman9001 who says, I would have to pick Gerald's game. Our protagonist Jessie is handcuffed to a bed and fights off an attempted rape by her husband Gerald. When Gerald passes away, the novel now oscillates between Jessie constantly dealing with her literal environment in this moment, the overwhelming pain in her arms, dehydration, stray man-eating dogs, and her failure to deal with the psychological pressures of her social environment in her past. The latter has led to the former. We learn that Jessie has a history of being abused by men that led her to acquiescingly allow Gerald to force her into the fetish play she did not want to be a part of. Without spoiling the ending of the denouement of the novel, finds her learning not to let the societal norm of dismissiveness towards women conquer her again. This is something that the otherwise fantastic adaptation did not quite capture as well as the novel IMO. Also, for anyone who read or watched the movie, here's your friendly reminder of the gloving scene.
Yeah.
Thank you, E-Man, for that wonderful image that's now in my brain once again.
That's in there. Yep. Thank you. Yeah, I almost let it fade, but now that you've refreshed it, it'll stay even longer. So thank you again.
Yeah, we talked about that movie on Other Levels of the Tower as well. Both really enjoyed it. You should definitely check out the book eventually, Matt. I know we don't have a plan to cover it on this show, but worth reading, I think.
I'm sure that I will.
Cool. And that is it. Thank you, everyone, for those answers. I don't think we did a great job of explaining exactly what we meant. So we appreciate y'all trying to answer anyway, and you did a great job.
Yeah, thanks.
Speaking of explaining what we meant, Matt, what is this week's discussion question?
What is your favorite tale of the woes of adolescence? Obviously, that's kind of what this book is about. Also, we have, McVree's mentioning, J.D. Salinger, John Knowles, James Kirkwood, Don Bredes. Funnily, I've barely even heard of some of these guys. I definitely read Salinger. Mm-hmm. We mentioned Fitzgerald offhand, and I Fitzgerald actually wrote a bunch of like adolescent woe novels, not novels, maybe novels. He wrote short stories.
Yeah.
Anyway, anything in the space, adolescent woe, the kind of story that McBreeze would find appealing.
I think Don Bredes is like the only one that I don't think I'd ever heard of before.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know.
Do you know him at all?
No, do not. We thought about asking you what's your favorite time somebody died due to blue balls, but we chose not to ask that one.
I mean, the problem with that is everyone would pick that one time in The Long Walk.
That's true. And
that would be a pretty boring answer to read 10 times in a row.
Fair.
All right, folks, that is going to do it for us this week on Kingslingers. Next week, The Long Walk continues with our penultimate episode covering chapters 10 through 13. I don't know what's going to happen, Matt, but I suspect there will be more walking.
Yeah, and more tickets.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Remember, you can reach us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter @kingslingerspod. And of course, the subreddit at r/doofmedia is the best place to give those discussion question answers.
And if you are not already subscribed to Kingslingers, this is the perfect time to do it. It is on the horizon. We've only got 3 or 4 more weeks until we are going to be reading Stephen King's It. And I am extremely excited, as I know all you are. So subscribe now. Don't miss it. Don't miss it. Don't miss
Gotcha.
it.
Yeah, I got it.
Like with the capital, like it. Mm-hmm. It's a book.
Yep. And if you like any of our shows and you want to support us, then please consider donating to our Patreon account at patreon.com/doofmedia. Special thanks this week to new patron Dan C.
And of course, if you cannot afford to donate right now, that is and always will be absolutely okay. There are tons of ways of helping us out that don't cost you a dime. And one of those is to share the podcast with folks, especially as we move into that big old book we're going to be talking about next. That's a very popular book, and we think there might be a lot of future listeners out there who will want to listen to us talk about it. So share it with them. You can also leave us a rating and a review. This week's Spotlight review comes from Jod Nivich, who gives us 5 stars and says, "Best podcast ever. I've been listening to this podcast from the very beginning. I listen to several other King podcasts that I will not name, and yours is by far the best. I love the premise of long time with new reader, and y'all's chemistry is great. I've read King since my childhood years in the 80s, and y'all are helping me see even more in the stories I've read multiple times. I really hope Mr. King is listening and gives y'all some time to talk to him. My first book of his was The Long Walk, and I'm loving seeing it through your eyes too. Don't even get me started on The Dark Tower. It's close to story perfection. Anyway, keep up the great work. I really appreciate it. P.S. The Doofcast rocks too. And of course, I've now read the Worm stories. Holy crap.
Wow.
We converted them.
Yes, that makes me so happy. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Gosh, thank you so much. Yeah, that was wonderful. I also hope, well, do I hope Stephen King is listening? No. Yes. Both simultaneously.
Yes, I agree.
Schrodinger's listener.
I agree completely with that sentiment.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who has taken the time to leave those reviews. We love reading them. It's nice to see. And it does actually help us. Someone's going to read this review and give us a shot because of it. So thank you so much. All right. That is finally it for us this week. We will be right back here next week with more walking. Matt, the story is only going to get better. I promise you. You're going to have a couple of fun weeks for sure.
All right. I am very much looking forward to it.
All right, folks. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.